So this is the first video of the entire break here regarding MCQs. Wednesdays are going to be entirely MCQ focused, where there will be four passages for you to analyze and do within the drive itself. The first and second ones are usually the ones I'll cover through video, but then 3 and 4 are the ones that you do by yourself. Answers are provided, but otherwise, obviously do them first, right, and then later see how well you do. But anywho, this is the big confusing part of the AP laying exam because it's just that difficult to answer every single question 1 minute at a time as accurately as possible. It's very arbitrary, but we're going to go through a couple of tips and also just kind of like the mindset you should have in doing MCQs throughout this video, the next one, and also every video that we ever do for MCQs. So really, you got to hype yourself up for these MCQs just because they're boring. They're really boring. The passages sometimes are kind of entertaining, but otherwise the process itself is very nerve-wracking, very anxiety-filled. So you gotta hype yourself up and just make sure that you can engage it with an open mindset and also with just good energy altogether. First thing to consider is in the drive, it's been updated with the recent stuff that should apply to today. So we're looking at MCQ Prep 1, 2, 3, and 4. You're looking at Practice Work 2. You're looking at the 2 slides that go with these particular works here. So 1 and 2 you want to do before this video, and I'll mention this here real quick here. You want to do before this video because the video will cover all the answers and the process of how to do so. But let's say you would prefer watching this video first before actually, engaging with the text and the questions. Fine, you can do that, but at the very least, let me have you read the passages for the MCQ and do a little bit of analysis work that the homework asks you to do, because otherwise it ruins the experience if you know everything beforehand, right? So in this case, do 1 and 2 first, or at least read the passages for 1 and 2. Now, a little bit of MCQ philosophy that I want you to kind of like have while you're doing MCQs in general. Number 1, we're going to cover tips and stuff like that, but they ultimately mean nothing if you don't practice them or apply them during the actual MCQ process. So I know a lot of you know like process of elimination, for example, read the questions first and then answer it. Fine. Those are all good tips. But if you're not actually doing that on the AP exam or doing within these practices, then what's the point of the tip in the first place, right? You let your anxiety and your stress overwhelm you. So when I'm giving you these MCQs 1 through 4s every Wednesday, practice them. You know what I mean? Okay, let's try questions first. Let's try reading the passage first. See what works and see what is the best method for you to do it in the shortest time possible. At the same time, as you're practicing, don't do this on the AP exam, but as you're practicing, do these 2 things for yourself. For hard passages, do a close reading. You know what I mean? Get used to difficult texts because they're going to exist. A lot of the texts I give you kind of vary in terms of difficulty, but otherwise, those hard texts are the ones that are like 18th century, 17th century, nuanced philosophy, science, psychology type readings here. Those are the harder ones that I want you to try close reading more, understand what the author is saying, because the more you can do that, you're basically like weightlifting, right? You're getting used to the entire process of reading more difficult text in a shortened time. But then there's also easy passages. Those you want to practice speed. How quickly can you process it? How quickly can you understand it, annotate it, whatever? These are the ones that you are basically doing a time test. See how you can do without those weights, right? And then later, with those 2 combined, you will build reading comprehension and do MCQs that much better. Now, speaking of tips, let's talk about the first one, right? There are a couple of different types of readings on the AP exam itself. Do you need to read the entire work is one of the biggest questions of the reading passage world, test-taking world. Here's the deal. Here's how I would break it down. You never want to read it like line by line, or you never want to read it so close where you're doing like textbook reading, for example. But you want to skim at least. You want to make sure that you're going like paragraph by paragraph and understanding the gist of everything here. So here's my formula in terms of how I would approach the readings. If it's an easy one, like an easy, say, narrative, I would skim that one. I would just get like a general idea of like, okay, what's this one about for the most part? Even though the italic part in the beginning tells you who's writing, who's speaking, and so forth, what time period it's from, I want to get a gist of like the keywords that stand out or like character names and whatever. Just kind of get a general idea, right? Now, if it's like an easy nonfiction essay where you're looking at it and you're like, wait, the language is pretty easy, I would still skim those, but we mentioned this before, let's look at topic sentences, right? Let's look at what the body paragraphs themselves include for the most part. How has the author divided their thought process step by step by step? Now, difficult readings, scan. Now, there's a difference between skim and scan. Scanning you're looking for words to stand out. So skimming is kind of like for general comprehension, but when you scan, it's more so of like, okay, what are some of the key words that stand out to me? What are some of the proper nouns? What are some things that just pop out in general here? I'm not looking for understanding yet, but I'm just looking for what are some of the subjects of this reading here. That goes a long way because at least you know what the gist of the entire reading is from a topical standpoint rather than just comprehension standpoint. Now, there's also difficult, nuanced readings. That's difficult. Difficult readings are like narratives that are a little bit more confusing. Those, again, I'm scanning. But the nuanced readings where you can tell the author's using like really high diction and it's really jargony, it's really confusing, go straight to the questions. Those actually are tricks by the College Board because their questions are all going to be like, hey, what do lines 1 through 3 say? Good. What do lines 4 through 7 say? Good. And you start realizing like, wait, the questions are just in order. I should have just gone through the questions themselves. And that's the point here. For nuanced ones, just go right to the questions. Because you'll notice they go straight by straight, 1 to 3, 4 to 5, whatever. They just make sure that you can comprehend it piece by piece. So let's talk about scanning, right? The italics part basically lets you know if it's like a modern or a more antiquated reading here. So for easier ones, like let's look at the one that you're looking for MCQ 1. The following passage is accepted from a recent book of essays. Oh, good. It's probably an easy one, right? So in this case here, it lets me know that I don't need to scan, but I can skim. Now, I'm looking at it a little bit here. I'm looking at like how it's structured. There's something preemptive about laziness, something that smacks of a decision. Okay, it looks like someone's talking about laziness, and they're going to maybe like deliberate a little bit of their philosophy regarding laziness. Seems like an argumentative essay or something like that. So in this case, it's relatable. It's an easy topic. The reading itself doesn't seem super tricky, but otherwise, I'll let my eyes scan through and see how it works. And if you have already, you'll realize that this one here really is just kind of like, it's not editorial, but it's standard essay writing. You know what I mean? It's someone who's giving their contextualization of what laziness is. And it's nonfiction. It's perfect. It's not a narrative piece. It's more of, body paragraph. So let's try the topic sentence style. This is my breakdown of all the topic sentences that exist in here. I'll read them verbatim first, and I'll talk about the red line next to it in terms of how I kind of process the entire reading here. So the very first paragraph starts off with, as I mentioned earlier, there's something preemptive about laziness, something that smacks of a decision to refuse all offers even before they're put on the table. The lazy don't come to the table. It seems like laziness pushes everything away. It seems like the lazy don't even try to participate. So at the get-go, the first paragraph deals with the author's definition of laziness or their portrayal of laziness. Second paragraph, the secret to failure is far more elusive than the secret to success, lacking behind when one could. And it cuts off there, but it seems to me what I'm picking from this one is there's more to laziness than we know, or there's more to failure than we know. And it seems the two and two are tied together, and the author's going to kind of consider like failure isn't maybe just about laziness, there's more to it than that, or it's more nuanced than we think. Next paragraph, laziness just is. Okay, kind of a short sentence, let's continue a little bit more. It's like being freckled or color blind. Indeed, when the world was younger, intelligent people believed they had no choice in the matter of who was naughty or nice. Okay, it looks like laziness is like a preconceived or a predetermined thing, right? Everyone is naturally lazy in their own ways. You can't define it or explain it. It just is, kind of like how you're born in this case. I mean, you can biologically figure out, I guess, but that's besides the point. It seems like the author is just saying like laziness just is. There's no way to explain it. Next paragraph, happenstance also has its place. I don't deny that, but do any two people react identically to the same stimuli? Which is a good question, right? It seems like the author now is talking about the rhetorical situation where, and I'm assuming still laziness, assuming that you haven't read the entire piece in its fullness, if a lazy person, for example, or any person is given two people the same stimuli, like the same sort of push, will they react the same? And probably not. Like just knowing how people are diverse in this way. So the author asks a rhetorical question that refers back to laziness. If two people push the same way, don't react the same way, the laziness must be the same in this way, its own way too. Next paragraph. Because of some unpredictable sequence of recombinant DNA and early experiences, I always knew I'd write things. Wait, hold on. It seems like the author is now shifted to themselves. This is more a personal narrative, perhaps, or at least they're using themselves as anecdote experience here. Interesting. Last paragraph. As for the laziness that moves with me wherever I go, I have finally found a way to make it work for me. So it sounds like the speaker has mastered laziness. It sounds like the speaker at the very end has contextualized laziness for themselves exclusively. So I've noticed that this essay here has shifted from talking about laziness and all that to the author talking about their own laziness. Boom. That does a great deal of work for me as a reader, because without the information, I now know tone shift or topic shift, and also know a gist of what everything is and where it is in the reading itself. So without further ado, let's talk about that information that we just had, right? It's all about understanding the author's POV. They're lazy. They're talking about how laziness perhaps is more complex than we think, and at the same time that they've mastered laziness for their own usage. That's all gold for you in terms of understanding the entire piece here and understanding how it's structured so you can approach the questions. Because again, the questions are structured from beginning to end chronologically. So in knowing how the entire essay works, it helps us better approach those questions. So let me make sure that you actually read correctly and carefully. For each MCQ that we cover, I want to talk about what it actually includes once you've close read it and so forth here. So paragraphs 1 through 6, they basically are broken down in this way. Number 1, paragraph 1, laziness is more about one's inability or reluctance to participate in society. So laziness isn't just because you are born lazy, I guess, necessarily, or that you can't do things. Is more because you don't want to do things. So laziness is just kind of like the body reacting to situations, telling you and the world, I don't care. Paragraph 2, laziness is more complex than you think. It says something to completely disconnect from expectations, which is a good question, right? Because for a lot of people, they have drive to succeed. They want to overcome and to defy expectations, but laziness is more about, well, I didn't care about that from the first place. That expectation is not anything I care for. Failing sometimes is more difficult to do than succeeding. Paragraph 3, laziness isn't really learned. We come to this world designed perhaps to be lazy towards certain things. Again, it's like predetermined, predisposed. Sometimes we're just lazy towards certain topics and subjects because that's who we are. Paragraph 4, have to be careful about laziness. Not every stimuli affects people the same way. We talked about this previously, the hypothetical question, right? Not everyone reacts the same regarding laziness or activeness or whatever. It's all about how we utilize our own laziness or how we master it in our own personal way. Speaking of personal way, paragraph 5, author now discusses how in the field of writing, they too are lazy. Sometimes it's a weird paradox. It's a weird like back and forth. The author has a lot of like complex views in terms of how they embody laziness, but also how they master laziness. And in paragraph 6, the author makes like a bitter jab at the career that he or she's in, screenwriting, suggesting that screenwriters are just lazy people who sometimes have bursts of inspirations or whatever. So the entire thing seems to come collectively towards the author's anecdotal experiences of laziness altogether. So here are the answers. For number 26, you're looking at B. Question: which statement provides the best rhetorical analysis of the first sentence? So in this case, you're doing a rhetorical analysis. You're thinking about how the author begins the entire piece altogether. It's rhetorical analysis. We consider the effect of the author's choice matching the smallest of choices from the answers. Okay, actually, I don't know what I'm saying here. That seems like a weird description. All right, scratch that. Let's just look at the question itself and the answer itself. So for B, I think I meant process elimination. But anyways, the author adopts an authoritative stance on the topic by beginning with there is. So that seems to be the clearest one in terms of rhetorical choice, right? Author is someone who is a master of laziness or has some authority to speak of laziness. Let's talk about then process elimination for this one here. We'll just do one as an example because the explanation on the side is kind of janky. So A, the author betrays a sense of resentment by using the modification even before. Well, even if that's true, do you get a sense of resentment or betrayal, a tone of that sort? Not really. It's too early to tell. So in this case, unless the author really began with like a very strong tone towards the subject of laziness, the first one doesn't make sense. A doesn't make sense. C, the author defines the scope of his argument by referring to all offers. Not really. The author pretty much stays strictly to one particular topic and viewpoint regarding laziness. They don't really look at all the scopes yet. Again, it's too early to do that, right? With lines 1 through 3, you can't really go into all the scopes of what laziness includes. Those are for other paragraphs to perhaps do. D, the author expresses anger. Nope, no anger. Again, no tone for the most part. Can't really work with that. And E, the author suggests the difficulty of the topic by describing something in two contrasting ways. Not really. It's not yet they describe the difficulty of the topic. In fact, they never talk about the difficulty of the topic, but more about the complexity of the topic here. So in this case, none of the other options really look like rhetorical methods either. We're looking at B. B is the one that seems to be the most on rhetorical choices. 27, in lines 3 and 4, the author uses the word table idiomatically to discuss C, civic participation, because as you look at the rest of the paragraph, it deals with daily tasks of socializing and all that. So in this case, C is the one that deals more about what table means in this case. People coming to the table, participating at the table, that simply is civic participation. 28, in lines 12 through 14, given chance, the author's primary purpose is D, assert the power of the social contract. Because if you go back to those lines there, the lazy don't make use of the social contract, therefore they fail. Which in turn talks about the fact that the social contract is super powerful then. If you don't abide to it or you don't participate in it, it's really going to screw you up. The author's writing in lines 5 through 14, quote, at bottom, chance, is characterized by the use of B. This one's tricky because, remember, we had the answer earlier about broadening the scope. We'll talk about that in a second here, but for some of you might have chosen A. A is close because we do see a bunch of like short fragments, but number one, those aren't sentences, those are fragments, and number two, we see like a listing, so we think like, oh, they're accentuating key facts and opinions. Well, are they though? They're not really facts or opinions per se, but they're more about just opening the discussion broader regarding this topic of laziness here. So it has to be B. It's a series of things that make us understand laziness from a different standpoint or from a bigger standpoint altogether here. C doesn't make sense because there aren't a lot of adjectives used as nouns. By the way, that's called gerunds. But anyways, there's none of that being done. D, there are dashes used, but they're not to indicate hesitation. And E, abstract language, no, everything's pretty clear for the most part, so it has to be B in this case here. 30. In the second paragraph, lines 15 to 23, the author primarily implies that laziness is answer A, factor contributing to failure, but not the sole cause. Remember, we looked at a paragraph that talks about how failure was thinking about, well, what contributes to failure. It's not just laziness. It's a factor, but it's not the sole cause, right? So it's more complex than we think. Failure seems to be more multifaceted, more layered. So in this case, just having that structural knowledge helps a lot to answer some of these questions here. 31. The author's tone in the statement laziness just is can best be described as C, pragmatic. This one's tricky because it's all about process elimination. If you don't know what these words mean, then it's time to figure out what do you understand from the choice then, and which word best associates, but maybe even more so, which words don't belong there in the first place. Here's a question. Generalize your impression. How do you think the author depicts laziness? Just from that line there, laziness just is. Sounds like the author is being like matter of fact. It sounds like they're being straightforward. Basically, it's kind of like when we say on a daily basis, it is what it is. That seems to be the author's intention. So let's look at some of the words here and start cutting down. Apologetic, that's a very basic word. We know that's not that one. Morose, which we looked at in class before, which means like sad in state or like, what's sort of synonymous with depression, but it's not quite the right word. But you know what I mean? Like morose is just sad, right? It's not that. Apprehensive means like you're holding back a little bit, not that either. So if you didn't know, you might be down to B and C, but I mean, even B, embittered, the word bitter exists in there, so it probably isn't B as well. It has to be C then. Even if you don't know what pragmatic means, just from process elimination, it has to be C in this case. And that's how your mind should work in this case here. What did you see from the text? What do you understand? Which best associates to yours, or which ones don't associate with your thought process or observations at all? By the way, pragmatic just means like practical, or someone who is like reasonable, trying to make use of it. You know what I mean? Like authors trying to talk about laziness more as just like not useful necessarily, but they're trying to make use of this topic here. In the third paragraph, lines 24 to 41, the author discusses Hippocrates' theories in order to... Now, this one's hella tricky because if you go back to lines 24 to 41, you're thinking like, good God, I can't understand what the hell's being said here, because you can identify where the Hippocrates part is, right? But in reading it, you're just like, what? Holy shit, the explanation is confusing as hell. But usually the authors and the College Board not the author, sorry, College Board itself kind of like not tricks you, but they'll pick these confusing parts because they're again testing your test taking abilities. So if you look a little further down, you'll notice that at the end of this paragraph, there is a last sentence that basically contains, this is what I'm saying, essentially, kind of sentence. And that will give you the answer here, which is E, established a long-standing belief that habits of mind are innate, which means that we are predisposed or pre-existing and so forth there. So if you look at that very last line where it's like 4041, it kind of gives the author's actual reason of talking about Hippocrates and all that there. Or if you're very sly, you can just remember that this paragraph deals with the idea that laziness is predisposed or preconceived, or you just basically have it when you're born, which E best stands there, right? That these habits of mind are born into you. 33. At the end of the fourth paragraph, lines 42 to 56, the author acknowledges that people, B, can control their behavior. This is tricky because a lot of it talks about like hypothetical situations and so forth, but if you look at the very end of this paragraph, and oftentimes the kind of conclusion or like last statement is there, author mentions this line of like foot on the pedal, which is a euphemism of like we're in control. So if we're looking at B, can control their behavior, that seems to be the one that is most related or connecting to that idea that the author proposes regarding our laziness or just our habits born onto us here. 34. Why does the author mention Bill Gates and Valentino in lines 50 to 53, sharing a bucket, Valentino? So the answer is D, to assert that people do not have a definitive path in life, which is true. If you look back in that paragraph, he talks about kind of like things that could have happened but didn't, and the whole thing's about could haves, right? So in this case, it talks about this idea of like definitive. That's not guaranteed, much like anything else. Nothing is guaranteed within people. You can always kind of like make choices that take you away from like fate or just your destiny or whatever. There's no, again, definitive way. Number 35, which statement best describes the significance of the Beckett quotation in lines 62 to 65? There is to express answers A, writing is inherently a paradoxical endeavor, because the quote, if you go back to, excuse me, the quote, if you go back to it, basically says this: there's nothing worth expressing, but we feel the need to express. Like, wait, what? That sounds really back and forthy, because it is a paradox. So in this case, writing itself, from the author's point of view, from Beckett's quotation, is one big paradox. Writing really has no purpose whatsoever, but there should be a need to write. 36. The author assumes a self-important tone in lines 65 to 70 as a solid big answer to E, mock himself so as to build credibility with his audience here. Author is being sarcastic here in talking about this sort of viewpoint. Like, look, even though I'm lazy, there are times where I actually want to produce something. So in this case, going back to the paradox before, but also with this point of like a self-important tone, the author is trying to like basically glorify writing when really doesn't deserve glorification in the first place. 37. In the fifth paragraph, the author suggests that the truest answer, line 34, is A, requires a level of philosophical awareness that defies human expression. Okay, this one's going to be kind of weird because it's going to be a little existential and a little bit like Sartre, a little bit like that, right? We mentioned this in first semester, but my point is this. The author gives this analogy or like this example of like there's this blank spot and we should fill the blank spot because we're there already, but there's no reason to fill in the blank spot. Like, whoa, what the hell, right? But look at the answer for A. Requires a level of philosophical awareness that defies human expression. So in this case, you want to be philosophically aware of your situations. That B then defies human expression, meaning that you are defying what our conventions are, because human expression is seen to be something that is, we think it's natural, or we think that it's planned out, or we think that there's a purpose to everything, but really our expressions are not planned out. We're just there because might as well. It's kind of like when you're doing a test, right? You look at the test questions and there's a blank spot and you think to yourself, like, there's no point to fill this out. Like, at the end of the day, there's no work that asks you to do it. There's no point in doing so because it doesn't help you as a human being, but since I'm here, I might as well do it. That's his point there. So in this case here, it's kind of like really philosophical and existential. I know I paused a lot for this one here, but I guess that's what philosophy does. It makes you like sit there and try to like word out everything and figure out what you actually mean in that purpose there. 38. Based on the author's views in the first paragraph, the truly lazy would most likely respond to an actual examination question by, okay, this one's really, really weird because this one basically requires you to have the POV of someone who is truly lazy. So think about the previous question, right? Someone who is truly lazy would not want to do anything actively or, from their own volition. But if they're there, they might as well do it. So let's say someone invites you to do an examination, for example. The truly lazy would refuse to enter the examination room at all, because if it's a lazy person, they don't want to participate in the social experience or whatever, right? So in this case, you had to understand what the author's POV of laziness was in the first place and how to use that to answer this question here. And the last one, which statement best describes a major turning point in the passage? Yes, this is the payoff. Remember, we talked about the shifting of this essay altogether and how it goes from talking about laziness as a general topic to the author's own experience. So this one's D, but careful, D and E are both paragraph 5. So we know paragraph 5 is where it exists, but we now have to read the particular specifics in terms of which one's most accurate. So D says, the author's objective analysis of laziness gives way to subjective experience. Yes, subjective experience, right? His own personal anecdotes in terms of the situation itself. But for E, the author's criticism of laziness turns to justification. Not really. He's not really justifying anything. He's more about just explaining his own particular way of life and all that there. So in this case, it has to be D, and the payoff from our reading of topic sentences finally goes through. Yeah, that was a long video. I'm not sure if I want to do this for the second one, just because it's really hard to keep train of thought for all the questions and so forth, just without note cards and all that. So I'll let you know if I make another one, but otherwise I'll post this one up for your own usage for MCQ Prep 1.